Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another episode of CS Cyber. I'm Chad.
I'm Sean.
Sean, every day.
All day.
Yeah, and this is our first episode of the year, right? So we're starting a brand new series. This over the next 14 to 17 weeks, we're going to be focused on NIST 800-171. And today, really, we're just kind of kicking it off, right? So we're going to be talking a little bit about what NIST 800-171 is, how it came to be. And then over the next, like I said, 14 to 17 weeks, we're really going to be doing a deep dive on the control families, the controls. And we're really hoping to give you practical ways to implement some of these controls. It's all about being practical, right? Like that's what we're trying to do with this series. So
yeah, 800-171 can be a little complicated. It's gone through a lot of changes. It targets, a segment of traditionally the defense industrial base, organizations that need that compliance with the government. So they're working with defense contracts and those types of things. So yeah, hopefully we can kind of demystify this a little bit.
Yeah. So let's just jump in.
Let's go.
So what is NIST 800-171? So it's a framework for protecting controlled unclassified information in non-federal systems. So we're not talking about federal systems here. We're talking about, the businesses that support the defense industrial base, or not support the defense industrial base, but Geez, man, it's a rough start to the.
That's okay. You'll get through it.
We're talking about businesses that support the government.
That's correct.
Yeah. So NIST is structured there's been a couple revisions of NIST, right? So 800-171 R2 is probably the most widely used, widely known. It's 14 control families, 110 controls. But recently R3 was released that made some changes there, right? So a couple more control families and actually reduced the number of controls by combining some and getting rid of some redundancies. So just kind of really wanted to start off with like a brief, history of NIST and how this became to be, right? So you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I remember in 2015 when it first came out. So special publication 800-171, June of 2015. We had just started the company in 2015. And I remember by 2016, we were really, really doing a lot of them. There was a lot of government supplement money out there assisting with getting a lot of these contractors assessed because there was a lot of them. I don't know what the total number of defense contractors are nationally, but it's a lot. And a lot of them are smaller organizations.
Yeah. So, I kind of think of it as like, the DIB is like really a puzzle piece, right? Everybody may be working on like a bigger project, but they have like a little piece of the puzzle. So there's bigger pieces and then there's smaller pieces, right? So protecting those is all wrapped up in this document. So 2015, the initial publication was released. 2016, DFARS comes onto the scene and requires contractors to kind of start reporting cyber incidents to the DoD. 2018, there was some revision 1 that was like some minor updates. 2022 or 2020, revision 2 came out, and I think that's the most widely used and known and reviewed document. And then 2022, the DoD came out with CMMC, and
and I want to also include that the Department of Defense had put a bunch of drop dead dates in there. So it really got contractors aggravated because, and many of you listening to this may know this already, they throw out a date. We have to be compliant by this date. And then they would change their mind and go, nah, we're not, it's not actually that date. And that's pretty aggravating. And then what that does is that leads to a compliance standard losing its credibility.
Right.
So, yeah. I just remember the roller coaster ride.
Yeah, and it was still going up until like last year, right?
It kind of is in a form already still going.
Yeah. And then 2023, Revision 3 came out, did some changes with some control families. So, yeah,
that kind of sums it up.
Right, so that's just kind of a brief history. So
that's where we are now, right? We're at Rev 3?
Rev 3.
Okay.
But then there's some complications with there. I think CMMC is still referencing Rev 2 and...
Right.
Yeah, so...
And I think a lot of these controls, too, are built for smaller organizations, smaller defense contractors, because there was a lot of rumor out there in the early days that the Department of Defense was trying to weed out smaller contractors, and I don't think that's actually the case. I think that that they've made a lot of these revisions based on a lot of feedback, because you have to handle these controls are meant to deal with small companies that maybe one or two people that are manufacturing something for a defense contract, all the way up to like your Lockheed Martins and Boeing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. They're all. I mean, they're all under the same umbrella, right? I mean, they have to abide by the same rules.
Correct.
And that's easier for some than others.
Yeah. So what's the purpose? The purpose is protecting what?
CUI data.
Okay. And what is CUI?
Controlled unclassified data. So what does that mean?
Right.
So CUI is sensitive, unclassified information that requires protection, but is not classified as national security information.
Right. Okay.
So that's a lot, right? So ideally, CUI data would be classified when coming from the government, but it can be a lot of different things depending on what you're producing and what you're receiving. You could actually even create your own CUI.
Yeah, very easily. And I think one of the best examples of CUI is like a drawing that you would get. So if you're making something, right, maybe in that part of the process, they send you a schematic,
Right.
or a drawing. That's certainly CUI.
Right. So examples include, financial data, PII, research data, intelligence-related information, scientific data.
Yep.
Things like that. So I get a lot of questions about that. Like, what is CUI? And it's a lot. Like, I can't really put that. I guess that's the best definition I have. It could be anything technically that's created. So
yeah, I remember in the days that I was doing assessments, that was one of the hardest things to help contractors with. Was they wanted us to go in as a part of the assessment. They wanted us to identify CUI, and it's not that easy. There are some tools out there, right? I mean, at one point, Netrix had a discovery tool that you could use to, and it still exists today, to go through your organization and look for things like PII and
right.
And
but
stuff
that's
like
a
that.
lot easier to find, right? I mean, if you're
It
after
is.
PII, that's PII
Yeah.
because it's a name, it's a
It is.
social, but that doesn't necessarily equate to CUI data just because it's hard. Yeah,
no, it is. And one of the biggest things that we ran into, and I'm thinking of a specific contractor that a couple of them. Many of these defense contractors also do commercial work.
Yeah.
So they're just picture a manufacturer, right? And then half of the building does DIB, Defense Industrial Base. They have a contract with the military. And then half of them are making something that's not military-wise. And then what happens is they create one domain, one file server, right? And they've merged the two.
So now your whole company
has to be compliant.
Yeah.
That's been the hardest thing.
Yeah, and I've seen, and it's really to that point, like it's kind of a tipping point. How much of your business is DoD work versus commercial work, right? I mean, if you're doing 10%, maybe it makes sense to carve out that little nook just for them. But if you're doing 75%, probably just need to go ahead and do your company.
Yeah.
So overall, like, why does NIST 800-171 matter? So, I mean, I thought about this. Really, it boils down to national security.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is why China has something that looks just like the F-22.
Right. So let's just kind of talk through like a quick scenario, right? So F-22, right? So there's an aerospace company experiences a data breach. Maybe it comes in through phishing, a compromised login, something like that. But then, attackers gain access to CUI data. To your point, maybe it's some blueprints, maybe it's a drawing. So what's the impact of that? What could be the impact of that, right? So delayed the project, exposed the data. It's just one piece of the puzzle, but maybe it was the missing piece, right?
Well, I think the biggest impact too, well, maybe not the biggest, so I don't want to classify it on a level, but an impact is you could lose this contract. So if you're Well, let me say this. Many contractors don't know, or they do know, that the date that you answer an RFP or a response from the government to get a contract with the military, the day that you sign that contract, you're attesting that you're already compliant with everything we're talking about today.
Right.
Okay. So now that that's out of the way, you could lose the contract. If you experience a cyber incident and the government ends up auditing and finds out that you're not compliant, now that is leading into why all this exists in the first place, right?
Right.
They are leading up to NCMMC certification, that type of thing.
Right.
But yeah, losing the contract is financial loss for sure.
Right. So reputation, financial loss of contract, national security risks. Nobody wants to be the company that gives China the missing piece of the puzzle.
No.
Right.
No, and that's another good point is this isn't going to happen on purpose. Like nobody's going to intentionally do this, right? They're going to have a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. There's going to be something that led the CEO of the company to understand that his organization was compliant and they're not.
Right.
But that's also not a excuse.
Right. So there are some benefits to being compliant. I mean, overall, you're strengthening your own business's cybersecurity posture, right? You're maturing your organization. You can bid on those contracts if you're already compliant. So yeah, I mean, there's reasons to align yourself with NIST other than just going after DoD contracts, right? I mean, it's a mature framework to gauge your cybersecurity maturity off of.
I'm definitely an advocate for you should be doing something. So if you're operating in an industry that doesn't have a regulatory requirement, 171 might be something that you might want to look into, but I'll give a caution, just my own caution about 171. It doesn't cover everything. 171 is designed mostly to protect the data.
Right.
Okay. So having that elephant out of the room, it may not be the compliance standard that you want to go for.
Well, just in compliance standards, just in general, there's a lot of overlap, and there's some that go deeper, and there's some that are kind of less intrusive. But yeah, just don't stop. I mean, it's a continual process, right? So, right. So just kind of a quick, how do you become compliant? Like, where do you start? Really, perform a gap analysis, right? I mean, there's documents out there. There's a framework. There's a SPUR scoring Excel sheets out there. Just kind of quickly
Explain what SPURS is.
Oh, geez, SPURS. It's one of those acronyms that it's a supplier's risk score. What is it?
Yeah, it used to be under the Navy site, but the SPRS is used to basically report
supplier performance risk system.
Yeah, SPURS is designed for you actually have to respond with a score on how your organization is doing.
Right, and that magical number is 88, I think. You have to like score, that, so it's,
it is magical.
It starts at negative, so.
Yeah, right, which is very confusing.
Yeah. So you got me all sidetracked here. So gap analysis, right?
Sorry.
So take the NIST sheet, start going through it. Just your first pass, just kind of like gauge yourself. Am I way off here? Like, do I have a long way to go, or are we doing okay? That's a perfectly acceptable way to kind of just do like a self-assessment and gauge yourself. System security plans, you need a plan of action and milestone. Start implementing the controls you don't have. Some of these controls, right? I mean, we talk about this a lot. Some controls, you need technology, you need gear in place to actually satisfy the controls. Some of these controls are configuration changes. Like, it doesn't cost anything to make your passwords more secure. It doesn't cost anything to put a GPO out there that disables USB ports or whatever the need is. So just don't look at this as like another cost. I mean, really look at it as we're increasing the security of our organization.
Right.
So some common challenges we see. Resources is probably one of the biggest ones. I mean, there's 110 controls. You have to go through them. You have to spend time looking at them and reviewing them and assessing your organization. So it's not an easy lift. I mean, it takes some time on your part to do.
Right.
Some of the requirements are vague. So I see people get bogged down in this a lot. They start thinking about like one specific aspect of their environment, and well, we don't have MFA on everything.
Right.
Like, so don't get bogged down in that. Just try to think of it, especially like your first pass through, just kind of holistically. How don't get bogged down.
Yep. I'd say that's probably the number one thing that happens.
Yeah. So.
And the controls are vague for a reason.
Right. There's a lot of interpretation in how you can satisfy that controls, and that's one of the things that we're working on for episode 2. We'll jump into access control. We're really working to kind of provide technologies and what's maybe a good, better, best solution for satisfying that control.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that's all we got today.
All right. I think that's a great lead in and a great summary. And I'm looking forward to talking about, getting into the meat of this with, tool recommendations and, kind of our interpretation on some of these ambiguous controls.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thanks for attending.